Welcome back, everybody. Mike Zuzolo at Global Commodity Analytics. You're listening to Zuz on Commodities. We added a new subtitle, Brick by Brick. We're going to explain that a little bit better. Welcome back. Thanks for joining us. Last episode, just to catch you up a little bit and kind of refresh you, because we're going to dig deeper into our arc of analysis. We've got China sitting as a non-benign power. In other words, we had developed and I think successfully shown that China is looking at being a revisionist power. You'll remember that if you listened to it. I mean, if you didn't listen to last month's episode, please do that because this is really crucial. It's a revisionist power, and it's a power that in economic or international theory would not be idealistic. It would be instead a realist. And this goes back to Morgenthau and how they define hard power and politics based upon hard power. So that's our beginning point. Our ending point was to talk about the US and China and how they're going to end up working or not working together. I went on record in the last podcast to say this was not going to be good, that this was probably going to be a situation where these two powers collide. And I'm saying that because in the arc of analysis, you have in the very peak of that analysis the repeat that I think we have to go through of what we did not finish correctly in the 1980s. And we have what I developed a few years ago, this New East and New West mindset. And part of the New East, with China being the key driver of the New East, is the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, believe it or not, I'm going to tie together the New East and the New West and the Belt and Road with the 1980s. And I've got some really phenomenal stuff to show you. What we're going to do is we're going to take a little holiday and we're going to go to Cancun. Cancun in 1981. But before we do that, I wanted to catch you up on the Middle East and what I'm seeing right now. And, we're at a point where, as we tape this, we're sitting down with Iran during a ceasefire, what I would call a quasi-ceasefire. And I call it a quasi-ceasefire because although we've slowed down dramatically the amount of military bombings and air sorties that are being flown, we're still not getting ships through the Strait of Hormuz. We're actually seeing only about 5 to 8 ships being sent through a day. And it's being controlled by Iran. And before the Strait of Hormuz went down, and before this U.S.-Israeli-Iranian conflict started, we're at a situation where we're doing over 100 ships per day. To put it into context to you, in terms of a market guy, a commodity guy, we had, before the ceasefire, a spot Brent crude oil price, cash price, off the London futures, in the cash market of about $141 a barrel before the ceasefire. On Thursday afternoon, after the ceasefire was announced, that made a new record high. And I double check me on that if you need to, but I think it's a new record high of $144 and change per barrel in the cash market. So the trade is clearly, now Friday's close, I think we were back below 100 in the futures at WTI New York. But I think this is another bigger point on the commodity side of the equation is what's the cash price doing? What's the futures price doing? We can say that when it comes to the crude oil. We can see that when it comes to what the European natural gas price is doing versus the United States natural gas. We can see that when it comes to the European wheat futures versus the U.S. wheat futures. There's still a very big divergence, very big disconnect the market hasn't been able to come together with when it comes to the futures trade versus the cash trade. I'll probably save that for another episode and talk about that at another time because that would take probably a whole episode to talk about. But before we go on and before I talk about any more about the update on what's happening in the Middle East, Tom, did you have any questions?
Yeah, could you quickly explain why it went up after the ceasefire?
I think the trade's just not buying into it. I think the simple fact of the matter is you can see probably on my computer in the background, I've got 2 different maps showing one real time, one not. It just shows you where the Strait of Hormuz has activity. almost everything that's gone through has been countries that are more favorable to China, or excuse me, to Iran, like China, and India got a pass on a couple ships this past week. I just don't think the trade is buying into the idea that this ceasefire means anything, especially with Iran coming out and saying on Friday and even Thursday night, we want a toll. We want $1 million a ship to be able to come in and let you through, because we know where the mines are. We know where the robot ships are and the AI is to blow ships up. So in other words, we're going to have that. You're going to have to get our clearance if you want to get through this strait. I think that's a real big issue for the trade. Obviously, it's a big issue. And I think this brings up a question that you may have had last time, and something that I think cannot be underestimated or cannot be forgotten. And when we're talking about the greater Middle East on the precipice of this potential ceasefire or worsening of a conflict and worsening of potential infrastructure and supply chains, statistics you're talking about when it comes to the general Middle East: 30% of the world crude production, 75% of the standby capacity, which means 75% of the world's capacity on standby that's easily accessible is in the Middle East. That's a huge number we just don't appreciate. You've also got 25% of the world's LNG exports in the Middle East, and probably just as important as the standby capacity is, about 11% of the refining capacity in the whole world is in the greater Middle East. And so for this to have an impact more negative than it already has, I think it's clear we have not priced that in. And I'm standing by the idea that every 30 days, not only is the genie out of the bottle now, but we may break the bottle itself, meaning the infrastructure, the supply chains, and everything. And then the genie can't get back in the bottle. So every 30 days, I'm adding another $15 a barrel to my New York support price, my base price, that I think that will hold as a low. So in April 15th, I go up to $95 a barrel for the new base price for WTI. May 15th, add another $15, so on and so forth. And I feel more and more confident about that as we've gone through. One other thing I've got a lot more confidence on, and this is really nice to be working into our talk today, is the New East and New West, because we're seeing it, ladies and gentlemen, in real time by what's happened here with the Iran situation. Two big things happen. The United Nations had a vote this week on a resolution to all the countries come in and defensively support the Strait of Hormuz militarily to get the traffic going again. Two countries said no: China and Russia. Those are our two main New East countries. So that gives you a lot of security of what I'm talking about when it comes to the New East, New West, and kind of the gloves coming off here. We're coming up against, we're getting that friction started, and it's starting to be kinetic. It's not just submerged and hard to see anymore. It's getting to be kinetic, and that's why I think the U.S. and China probably have one good opportunity to pull everything back. And I would equate it to, and this is maybe a stretch, but you remember in the Cold War, we had MAD, which was mutually assured destruction, which was due to nuclear weapons, that if both superpowers had nuclear weapons, then they would not use them. And that was mutually assured destruction because they knew they'd both be in extinction if they used it. I would say that we go from MAD here to MADE, mutually assured destruction economically. And I'm not talking about the United States and China fighting a kinetic military battle. I think that's low odds, but what I'm getting at with this New East, New West is that we're vying for the economic supremacy of the global economy. And this goes back to the idealistic mindset versus the realist mindset. I'm getting a little bit into the weeds here and starting to take you into our updated episode here. But one last thing on the Middle East and the New East, New West, and what we saw this week was President Trump did something very smart, in my opinion. He came in and said, any country supplying arms to Iran will immediately have a 50% tariff thrown on them. Well, if you're like me, that immediately says, China? Russia? Anybody else? So what happened after that was very interesting because all of a sudden the U.S.-Iranian ceasefire happened. And what did we find out about 6 hours after it happened? China played a leading role in Iran being pushed over the line to go ahead and say, yes, we'll agree to the ceasefire. So I think there is some pretty high-level gamesman and brinksmanship going on right now, but I think it's solidified for me that the tariffs and the economic warfare, remember what we talked about in the very first episode, President Trump's major foreign policy is his economic policy, is his trade policy, thanks to what these guys wrote for us way back a couple, 3 years ago. So we're really coming into the point now of the New East, New West. I'm ready to introduce the Belt and Road mindset at this stage of the game. But first, I want to tell you about another book that I've got. And I've talked about Robert Gilpin before. This one's another great one. And it sets the stage for, if you're wondering about, when we talk about Russia, we talk about China, we talk about the United States, and I'll put Russia in here. And we go back to, and I talked about this in the last episode, the Leninist Marxist ideology. And remember how I was talking about at the end that capitalism and the way Marx and Lenin looked at it, especially Marx, that communism and capitalism weren't that different in terms of their ends and what they did at the end as Marxism and Leninism evolved. Well, Gilpin puts a finer point on it. Ironically, both Marx and Lenin, in contrast to their present-day followers, this book was written back in the early 80s, by the way. So these present-day Marxists that were in the world, they were talking about post-Vietnam War, post-Korean War. You know, it's funny because nowadays, it's sad in a way, not funny. We forget what those wars were fought for and what they were fought about. And it was really about democracy versus communism and Marxism. And that's why I have such a passion for it, because as a political scientist, I oftentimes think we overcomplicate things, and we do, and we should really get into the what, how, and why, and how type mindset. But at the end of the day, when you think about the international politics ever since World War II and the warfare and the military battles and the conflict, most of them, Latin America, Africa, Middle East, Marxist, Leninist mindset versus democratic mindset, what would we call free market. I have a problem a lot with the free market mindset as it stands right here today. I won't go into that. But let's stay focused on this Leninist Marxist mindset and this ideology. So Gilpin goes on and says that ironically, both Marx and Lenin, in contrast to their present-day followers, acknowledged that the historical role of capitalism was to develop the world. We're talking about international development of the world, economic development of the world. Communist societies do not eliminate the profit motive. Rather, they put it in the hands of the state. That was Hawtrey back in 1952. The desire of a communist political elite to maximize the power and wealth of the state can dwarf the capitalist profit motive. This is a real big reason why I've got a frown face here as far as how the United States and China come out of this situation together. And it goes back to, we have, I think, one big chance to pull back from what I would say the mutually assured destruction economically is what we're looking forward to here, and how these two cultures, not cultures, but economies and political, realist political mindsets collide together. And that is the upcoming summit in China in May that's supposed to be going on between President Trump and President Xi. I'm hoping that we really see those two leaders sit down and say, we've got to figure out something that's the best for the world economy right now, and we both have to figure it out, because we can't keep going on like this. Because I think that's where we're at. And again, this is a very strong replay to what we dealt with back in the 1980s. And as I said in the last segment, we're looking at a situation where I think we're going back into the 1980s. We're like Michael J. Fox in Back to the Future, having to go back to the 1980s because we got to go back and clean up our, quote, mess in terms of what these two major thoughts, this idealistic mindset that got established when we should have had more of a realistic mindset. Tom, did you have a question?
Yeah, can you clarify in what ways we're going back to the 1980s?
Yeah, great question. I'll get to it right now. The last thing I'll say on this, though, is Marx, at the end of his life, Gilpin says, Marx himself, as he grew older and as the revolution failed to materialize, became aware of the narrowness of his economic dialectic and began to speculate that the key to history might be not the struggle of classes, but that of races and nations. The structure of the international system itself is greatly going to be affected, the capacity and willingness of a group or a state to try and change the system. So keep that in mind, because the important part about this is, I'm going to jump forward here, is that now we're talking about a political philosophy of Marx and communism that realizes A, the capitalism wanted to develop the state, and B, that he himself was wondering what it was all about by the end, and it was more about the nation, not the class of people. It was more about the nation and the cultures. And this goes to Tom's question. Science and technology is what we're really talking about when it comes to what made us jump into the idealistic mindset. And in the 1980s, to Tom's question, not accept the realist mindset of Ronald Reagan, the realist mindset of Margaret Thatcher. And I'll get to that Cancun meeting where they were both at that meeting in 1981. But Gilpin says this, I think it's really important. On the contrary, modern science and technology may intensify the conflict over the globe's scarce resources. It's important to inquire whether or not a unified humanity really exists. Unfortunately, it does not. The modern, quote, unified world has been a creation of the West, which has sought to impose its values, the way of life, on a recalcitrant set of diverse cultures. This unity was shattered economically and ideologically by the Bolshevik Revolution. So we're talking about way back in 1919, I believe, is when the Bolshevik Revolution was started. The modern revival of Islam and the revolt of other non-Western cultures against Western values may point to an even greater schism ahead. This is written in the 1980s. And so what this Gilpin is saying to us is, we've got an issue here where the West has not gotten it figured out yet, that they cannot do what they've been doing with modern science and technology. And the first thing that comes to my mind is, well, how does the other side of the world, the New East, think about AI? Even though China is one of the leaders in AI, what does the rest of the New East think about AI? We'll talk about that another time. In actuality, the political fragmentation of the world has increased in recent decades. Nationalism, with its roots in the 17th century Europe, has become the predominant religion of modern man. The present era is witnessing the proliferation of the nation state, not its transcendence. So this is a little bit thick, but I'm going to boil it down to you this way. What Gilpin is getting at here is the situation with the 1980s and what happened in 1981 at the Cancun meeting generated a brand new acronym that it's almost, I would say, not identical, but it's extremely parallel to the New East, New West. And that acronym is the NIEO. And that is the New International Economic Organization. Now, where did I come up with that? Order, not organization. This is an annual report to Congress, to the Senate specifically, from 1981. Willy Brandt, who was, I believe, the old chancellor. Was he the ex-chancellor? Yeah, he was the former chancellor of West Germany. He got together and proposed the idea that the global south, or what we would call, or I would call, the New East, was unhappy with how the United States and the developed, advanced countries were being treated, or were treating them, the new global south, or the New East. That situation got to a point where he got everybody together. I think it was 22 countries he got together in Cancun, Mexico in 1981 to discuss what they could do. And in this Senate report, it was very fascinating to me. It's about 400 pages, and I've not read the whole thing, so I'll probably talk about this more in a subsequent update. But the international monetary system was what the Willy Brandt, it's called the Brandt Commission. If you want to do a Google search to what I'm talking about, it'd be called the Brandt Commission or the Brandt Cancun Summit. And it was about the international monetary system needing reformed. And it's in this report that we have the new international economic order, a euphemism for an international economic system dominated by the developing countries. The Brandt Commission, headed by former German Chancellor Willy Brandt and consisting of several other prominent statesmen from the industrialized countries, fully supports the third world position. So all of a sudden now, whether you realize it or not, we've been able to go back into 1981 and talk about the new international economic order, and it was founded by the developing countries with the help of West Germany, a developed country at the time. And this is why I keep going back to, we have to come back and repeat and revisit the 1980s, because we haven't gotten it right yet. And I think that's why the New East and the New West is so dominant in my thinking, and why this New East, New West, just like we had in the 1980s, the West, the developed countries, pretty much had all the marbles until OPEC came along. And OPEC blew out the marbles. And then there were some developing countries that were winners. But if you think about a Latin American country that didn't have oil like Venezuela, you're talking about, and President Reagan talked about this in his speech when he went to the Organization of American States in 1982. And I can't remember the exact statistics, but it was crazy. He said in 1975 or something like that, it took 50 cases of bananas to buy a barrel of crude oil. Now it takes 500 cases. It was an extraordinarily big inflation and extra cost because of what the Middle Eastern countries did to the oil prices when they did the 73, 74, 79, 78 oil shocks. And so here we are back again at a major oil shock, and these major Eastern, New East countries led by China and helped by Russia, and now being helped by India, who have been supporting Iran for 50 years essentially, are now at a point and an advantage point where they could be taking the upper hand against the New West. And this is why it goes, this is where, how could they take the upper hand? Because of what China has done since 2013. They've created, President Xi, elected in 2012, started in 2013, the Belt and Road Initiative. Some statistics would say, excuse me, actual projects, 70 countries. But if you include projects and memorandums of understanding, you're into the 200, I think it was, in terms of the number of, 150. The 200 goes to how much has China spent or been able to accrue since the inception of the Belt and Road Initiative. $213 billion. That doesn't seem like a lot, but to a developing country, that's huge. And keep in mind, you have the Maritime Silk Road, which is the sea route of the Belt and Road Initiative. You have the overland route, but that has several different facets to it. In other words, you may have seen in the news where there's an Arctic route now being talked about in the Belt and Road Initiative that China and Russia are doing. Now, are you ready for this? There's another one that's pretty big. In fact, The CPEC is electrical, energy, transportation projects. Guess who is teaming up with China to do that? Pakistan. Who is mediating the Iranian ceasefire? Pakistan. Folks, I think it is not hard to see what we're seeing here with the New East and New West. And it's important to understand, and I'm not saying Pakistan is on China's side, but I can say I don't think Pakistan's on the United States side. It's probably that Pakistan's on Pakistan's side, but what we're talking about here versus the 1980s, and why I have a frowny face between the US and China and their collision, because they're both realists in international politics. China has the Belt and Road Initiative. They have Russia, unlike what we saw in the 1970s and 1980s. And now we have all these other countries that are participating and have skin in the game, so to speak. And I think this is going to be an extremely important time with this summit with the United States and China. I think I'm going to leave it there unless Tom's got some questions. Tom, you got anything for me?
Just to make sure I kind of understand this summary, are you basically saying that in the 1980s we took a idealistic direction while China and Russia took a realist direction, and we need to now revisit that because we may need to take a realist direction instead? Is that kind of correct?
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is where I lost us in the translation with Gilpin, and it wasn't Gilpin's mistake. I think this is where there is a spot here that I have not been able to find. I'm just not finding it, but that's exactly what happened. Was the way Gilpin put it is so much better and more eloquent than what I was able to do, is that in previous globalizations, technology and modernization is what pushed us through. That globalization and that modernism is actually based and founded upon idealist international political theory. It's odd to think that, but that's what my studies and my analysis has shown, is that it's not a realist mindset. It's almost as though the technology breeds the modernism breeds, hey, this could be such a better world and we could have a globalist world mindset. And that's something else that was very prevalent in the 1980s, was a globalist mindset. And that's where hopefully I can find that the next time we talk.
So can we get any information based on that as to where the economy and the markets might be trading if we're revisiting this mindset altogether?
Yeah, I mean, this is where it goes back to the Friday that we're taping this, the Friday that the U.S. and Iran sitting down. We just saw the University of Michigan consumer sentiment number for April. One of them was a record low going all the way back to 1980. We're dancing within about 40 or 50 cents a gallon on record diesel prices that were made back in 2022. We also saw an April CPI number that was over 3%. It was within the trade expectations, but we're now back over 3% and we're probably heading higher. I think the biggest issue I see right now, it goes back to the arbitration and the arbitrage of these spot prices in oil and energy, and the futures market not respecting what we're going through right now. My assessment would be the rally in the stock market, if we don't get a solid ceasefire with the U.S. and Iran, I'll step out this far and say, if the Iranians say no, they're saying no because they've got China and Russia's backing. And if that's the case, then it's game on. And it means then that the U.S.-China summit is going to have to mean a lot. In other words, it's going to have to go really well, because China must feel like they have the upper hand, and the U.S. and they have the U.S. in a box. And if that's the case, energy prices would go higher, the dollar would go lower. this stock market rally that we've seen, even though I do not sell stocks. I only do financial futures and options. I don't have a license for equities. I can't understand why this rally that we're seeing right now in equities would not be considered down the road as it was a relief rally to go back down and go to new lows. So that's kind of where I'm at economically, because it really does hinge upon if we're having to go back into the 1980s and the NIEO is the same thing as the Global South and the New East of today, or pretty much the same thing, because they're unhappy about the Western economic system and the monetary system we've designed, and they're coming back around and saying, we're still not happy with what you've done, and Iran's in a position to support the China and Russia New East mindset. It's a lot more difficult situation than what we faced back in the 80s, if you ask me.
Interesting.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.